following program on Ada Derana 24 is classified for general audience. It is intended for all ages. It contains little or no violence, no strong language, and little or no sexual dialogue or situations.
Tonight, we take a look at the laws related to migration. Both immigration and immigration are topics that have become quite common in Sri Lanka's public discourse. This is primarily in relevance to the economic situation within the country. But what are the key legal aspects that people must be aware of when considering migration? How does the process of citizenship work in different countries? What are the key migration regulations that are misunderstood by the general public? Welcome to Law, Land and Liberty, where we are keeping the promise of bringing in a contemporary legal topic and bringing it down for our viewers. Today is a very interesting topic because we are not going to only talk about Sri Lanka, we are going to talk a bit about other legal systems as well. But it will be pertaining to a subject that affects Sri Lankans and something that has been spoken about within the public forums these days very much, and that is in relevance to migration. Now we have with us an expert in this field and many other fields. Hopefully we'll get to speak to you again soon amongst other topics, but today he's here to give us a breakdown of what migration law looks like, particularly when it comes to Australia and Sri Lanka. And his name is Mr. Dinesh Irriyagolla Weerakkody. He's a solicitor and a barrister. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today on our program. So Mr. Dinesh, what we generally do is we give a breakdown of how we will be conducting the discussion, so it's easier for our viewers to keep up with what we are been discussing and the segments that we'll be discussing. So firstly, we're going to talk a bit about migration regulations. Secondly, a bit about the business and trade aspect in relevance to migration law. Thirdly, the issue of citizenship, a lot of things that we'll like to iron out there. And finally, reformation and ethics, something that we can really grasp from Mr. Weerakkody's experience.
Hello, my name is Derana and I am a law student. My question is, what are the key regulatory laws on migration?
All right, let's get into the direct discussion directly. Ms. Dinesh, once again, thank you for joining us on this program. A lot of things I want to iron out with you and discuss. Primarily our first segment, as we said within our introduction, we want to talk about migration regulations, a very vast topic and a lot of things that are unclear, particularly to the audience in Sri Lanka, the legal elements there. But I will have to ask you, given your experience, I want to start with something that was more contemporary, and that was the issue pertaining to the criminal justice that happens when it comes to a foreigner from either from our country who goes to Australia, the things that they'll face. I think it's quite clear to the audience who we will be speaking about in this scenario, but without going into any details of either the victims or the accused parties, what does it look like, Mr. Weerakkody, when it comes specifically to criminal justice when it comes to Australia? Now, there are certain parallels that I would want you to iron out. The perception is different to how we would view that specific subject, how Australia as a nation would view it. How do you enter that entire subject? I believe you've been asked this question multiple times from many individuals, and our viewers would also very much like to get an idea with this most recent issue. How have you seen the law in that scenario panning out? How have you seen the prosecution panning out? Because it has been a novel experience to us in Sri Lanka. How do you respond to that?
Yes, it has been very interesting in the sense to know how we perceive a problem, or our legal minds talk about this issue without having an idea in relation to how the Australian judiciary or our minds there, how we work. Yeah. The essential part or the critical aspect is we've moved away from victim blaming, right, to a more communication style model, and an affirmative consent laws are now very clear. We've adapted that in New South Wales, where the incident has occurred, and that will be implemented in Victoria in 2023, I believe. So the critical point is that the withdrawal of consent is acceptable, and we cannot prejudge in any situation. We shouldn't prejudge, but there is an aspect in a male dominant society It's still there, even in Australia. It's a very multicultural society, and we have many people from many cultures with many attitudes towards the treatment of women. And it's a challenge for us there as well. And our judiciary, definitely, the Law Reform Commission has very specifically mentioned this attitude change.
Right. I think it's a pretty fresh perspective when it comes to this specific issue, and as you mentioned, that transition from victim blaming, something that even I believe the Sri Lankan law to a certain extent does recognize, but I think when it comes to practice, it's still an issue in terms of public discourse. Please draw from parallels from that as well. I think it will be very important for our viewers to get your perception of what it looks like on the ground in Australia. But moving on to our topic for today, when it comes to migration law. Now, my first segment on migration regulations, because when you just go over sort of prima facie, the key things that you look at is, okay, when you are migrating from either Sri Lanka to Australia or other way around, the elements that either governments, either states look at. Is that sort of beginning accurate, or should we be beginning somewhere else when it comes to the question of migration law? How do you enter that entire subject?
In the sense, if you consider the Australian migration aspects, that depends on the person's background, as well as the requirements that he or she is trying to meet. For example, we've got a large skilled migration program. Australia depends on skilled migrants, and our economy runs on that, I can say, without fear. So,
just sorry to interrupt you, but even though the landscape is different, it's almost similar populations that are present in Sri Lanka and Australia, if I'm not mistaken.
That similarity is there, but there's in various other ways there's dissimilarities as well. You're right in relation to the population, but in relation to the economy, the laws, how we behave in many ways are different, also in relation to economic aspects as well. It's very regulated. The government organizations have policies, although the policies are not legal documents as such. We can have access, we have access, say for example, a migration policy through a system migration lawyers can access, and we can advise our clients on those aspects as well. Of course, you can't advise on a policy, but at least you can get a overall picture. And if the policy is not in line with the law, we can challenge, we can tell the department. We have stakeholder meetings, and we get to refine policies through the stakeholder meeting system. So I'm in a way very appreciative of that process.
I think moving to our the final segment, I want to take all of that in, the lessons that we can learn from this scenario when it comes to our systems here. Now, Mr. Irriyagolla, just getting deeper into the topic that we are talking about in terms of migration. Now, you spoke about skilled migration. Now, just give us a breakdown of what sort of regulations exist there, because I think most young adults would at one point in Sri Lanka have an experience of visiting the specific website that is involved in terms of skilled migration to understand the number of points you need. It's a conversation that happens nowadays mostly. And you, I believe you've been ahead of this for quite some time. You have seen the changes that have occurred there. So again, in a sort of introductory aspect to how migration works from the lens of Australia, what does skilled migration particularly mean? What is being looked at? What are the regulations that are there?
Yes, so basically the Migration Act and the migration regulations governs the visa system. Some people think that you can just go to a website, including the government website, and you can get migration advice. No, that's just very basic. In fact, as lawyers, we cannot even direct a person to get information from a website. Even the government website is website. The only place that we can direct anyone, including ourselves, is the Federal Register of Instruments, where the regulations and acts are there to understand the migration process and the law, basically. So, but coming back to your question in a very plain language situation, migration, the departmental website has a lot of information, correct or wrong. So you should have some sort of an idea. Now, what I've experienced here coming to Sri Lanka is that people who intend to migrate or intend to do business with Australia is lacking of that the basic information. So information. But so understanding the system is quite important. For example, a lot of people say when they want to migrate as a skilled migrant, I've done an MBA or I've studied at this place. Well, the question is, what's your occupation? Because we are talking about skilled migration.
What skill do you have?
Correct, exactly. That skilled, skilled and an occupation is defined in many ways. So your education or what you have studied or your title, job title, or the industry that you have worked on may not necessarily translate to a particular occupation in the skilled occupation list. So just because I've studied an MBA, can I migrate? People do ask that question. I've experienced as a say banking manager or whatnot. See, banking manager is not a skilled occupation. So I would direct those people to go and check the skilled occupation list and find out your occupation. Then work backwards. Similarly, those who wants to go to Australia and study, and if they have an intention to migrate or to do any profession, choose an occupation in the future, I would strongly recommend thinking ahead, get career guidance. Say, for example, what are the jobs that will be in demand in 2030? A cryptocurrency expert or a cybersecurity experts or occupations that we would not be thinking now. So think of the future and come back to the present and then map your pathway. So that's something I would like to say in a forum like this for the benefit of our viewers and others who have an intention of having a good career plan and migrating prospects as well.
I think that's very concisely put and very clear when you frame it that way, with it pertaining to what needs to be done. But Mr. Weerakkody, now just moving to the sort of legal elements here that are involved. What are the sort of consequences of not following this? Is like I think there are a lot of issues pertaining to asylum and everything that I want to take up to the latter part of our discussion. But if I think there are misidentifications or misrepresentations of what sort of skill that you may possess, there is a process that needs to be followed even in this scenario. Could you give us a small outlook as to what it looks like when it comes to the process?
Yes, the process should involve, now this is of course not a standard process as such, but it's good that if you can follow at least a standard process. For example, when you consult a professional to give you advice, you should consult a professional. What I mean by that is, in Australia, immigration advice can be provided by registered migration agents who are non-lawyers and lawyers. And not all legal practitioners, lawyers, practice immigration law because it's a very complex, specialized area. And not, as I said, from this year, not all migration agents are lawyers. And most are non-lawyers. And in overseas countries, I find it's very distressing to see that most advisors are not even registered migration agents. So you can't you can't get proper advice from a person who is not even registered.
Just a small follow-up: who is a registered migration agent? I mean, what are the characteristics there?
Or a lawyer. And now, registered migration agents means a person has been given the legal right to advise on immigration laws, but is a non-lawyer, not a lawyer. Now, I'm not fond of that process. In fact, I'm against that process. The fact is that those individuals or agents can register with, now I don't know the exact the current educational qualifications that they required to have. They can do a 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. Let's call it a 12 months course. And of course, I think they need to have some kind of a degree. And then give immigration advice. Well, lawyers study do double degrees for about 5-6 years, and then do the article clerkship, like the internship, and then do further supervised practice. And even after practicing for about 15 years, I've been there for about 20 years, it's hard for us to sometimes assess a person's circumstances and compare it with the relevant regulations to assess.
Yeah.
As I said, there's 30,000 pages of policy only, in addition to laws and regulations and court cases where we can get an idea. And so the experience, skills and judgment of a professional is not appreciated in countries like this.
Right.
And you don't consult, usually I find, people don't value, even when you are doing your career plan, the future or migration or coming back to Sri Lanka, whatever, I suggest, again, as I have done, I'm repeating myself, get professional advice, do your research, and go to a person who's registered, who's competent in that area. That's critical.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, Ms. Weerakkody. We want to take a short commercial break, and we can come back and discuss about the business elements in all of this, the investment aspect actually. We are in conversation with Mr. Dinesh Weerakkody. Stay with us on Law and Liberty.
My name is Sinarat and I'm a student at Sri Lanka Law College. When considering migration related to enterprise development, what are the most important laws one should be aware of?
Welcome back to Law and Liberty. We are in conversation with Ms. Dinesh Weerakkody, who is a solicitor and a barrister. A very important first segment that we just passed. I think our viewers very much appreciate the way you frame certain things, which is quite clear and it's very concise and clear. This segment primarily on investments now. Sri Lanka is on a run towards trying to get foreign exchange here within our country, and that has become sort of the foremost priority. I think within our conversations also what you mentioned was we, in certain scenarios, or if not most, we haven't fully understood how partnerships should be working, particularly with a country like Australia. In relevance to our discussion as well on migration and creating those partnerships, how do you in fact identify this sort of the investment law that is involved in all of this in creating either free trade agreements or partnerships of that sort moving forward, particularly for a country like Sri Lanka to benefit both in this scenario, Australia and Sri Lanka, moving forward? How do you enter that topic?
Now, I assess this going forward, the next century is the Asian century. Yeah. The Chinese and the Indian economies will, expand. Yeah. And we are right there in Asia, in a very important location. Geographically, strategically, so that's why geopolitics affects Sri Lanka that much. And on the other hand, Australia is there as well. Yeah. A Western country, the closest to an Asian region. Yeah. Sometimes people think Australia is in Asia. That's a different debate. But now, today I've learned there was a free trade agreement agreed between India and Australia. Yeah. And the Parliament has passed that now. Okay. So one of the benefits, and with UK as well, I think that yet to be accepted in the Parliament, but in all those agreements, in at least on those two agreements, Australians, if say for example the UK one, an Australian lawyer like me or an accountant can go to UK and practice, of course subject to certain requirements, but there's no major hurdles. Now imagine if that kind of an arrangement can be done with Sri Lanka and another country, especially a very strategic business partner. Yeah. The benefits that we would have, and the opportunities that would will be available to us. Now, I'll give you an example in relation to the Indian Free Trade Agreement. Yeah. As a result of that, Australia, there's tariffs to Australian products entering India is, I think, is discussed and is at a very low level. Right. So that benefits Australia. Also, one example that relates to immigration as well, Indian students who study there is eligible for an additional period of work. Okay. And so they can gain experience. Okay. So, I mean, ultimately that might benefit Australia, that person might decide to migrate. Yeah. But if that person is going back to India, he has already had a world-class education and a world-class experience in Australia, in one of the best livable cities in the world.
Right.
So for the past few years, I think we've just appointed an ambassador after a lapse of, I think, 3-4 years.
Right.
So there has been no one at that level even to initiate that discussion.
Okay.
So Sri Lanka can talk and have ambitions and whatnot, but if we don't take actions, we are nowhere. And in fact, we are lagging behind. So that is unfortunate, but the opportunities are there, and we must make use of those opportunities, especially with Australia. Now, there's a lot of Sri Lankans doing business with Australia on business visas and on investor visas. And a lot of Asian countries do the same. But there are issues in relation to red tape within this country when Australians want to invest, or Australian Sri Lankans want to invest back in Australia. Now, I've got an experience, maybe this is not the forum, very recently, if you permit me, I might.
Sure.
So a particular a bank in Sri Lanka promoted a fuel card with the relevant government department, where if you have a foreign passport and a local number, and if you pay in dollars, you are given that petrol card or whatever, the fuel card. And I took my passport to this bank. I was asked to go upstairs, then I was asked to go downstairs, and I met the relevant person, and the person was asking what my visa is and whether I'm a usual resident. And I asked the definition, because I'm a lawyer. And usual resident can be just 1 day or temporary, or you can be just a dual citizen, be a usual resident according to law. But anyway, I was not on a tourist visa. And ultimately, after about 20 minutes of discussion in between the managers and this manager and that manager, I was told, because I'm not on a tourist visa, I'm not eligible to get the fuel card. Here, the purpose of introducing is to get dollars. Now, if I had the way to decide the thing, I would decide whether you are tourist, whether you are a tourist or a visitor, whether you are from Mars or somewhere else, doesn't matter. If you're paying in dollars, just get dollars. We need dollars. Let anyone who comes with dollars, let them pay us in dollars. So that's a bad example that I can give, where we have failed. We have utterly failed. So I was not able to give dollars, pay dollars and get the fuel card. Anyway, I found a lot of tourists have returned back that fuel card because the locations that have been advertised are not even aware of that card. And if you go to a petrol shed, it's unfortunate that those people are now, I think, the richest, or becoming rich by just getting extra money to pump than the required level. So that kind of attitude will not help Sri Lanka to develop.
I think that's a very important distinction that you made there. Since you did speak about the investment visa and that aspect, I want to discuss you further on those lines. Now, if there is money moving from Sri Lanka to Australia, or the other way around, I think if we can start with Sri Lanka to Australia, what is the reception like from the end of Australia? What are the regulations that they have to exist? Or is it very much drawn out? It's very much easier to function in that way, like if you are moving, if you have to take a certain amount of money, is there a requirement to take a certain amount of money? What does that look like?
Yes, there are various kinds of visas based on various regulations. So depending on the nature of the investment, type of the investment capacity and the area where you want to invest, whether it's renewable energy or whether it's investing in property or construction or whatever you think of, there are avenues in various states. So states promotes investment. So bringing in money can be challenging sometimes, depending on the way that person wants to bring in money. Australia accepts any incoming funds through means which is accepted in law.
Right. Well, if you can just give us a breakdown of what.
For example, a transfer from a bank to a bank.
Right.
That's acceptable.
Right.
And if asked, the money trail should be able to be produced. So the what we call it black money is not accepted, and if an investigation is to transpire, the person will lose the confidence and probably the visas as well. So there is a potential danger, but as long as it comes through the proper channels, there's no issue.
Right. Just to build on that a bit more, I don't know if I'm deviating too much, but since we did reference cryptocurrency as well, does Australia have some policy of accepting that as payment in terms of either forms of, is there a discussion that is happening there? Because Sri Lanka, I think it's still in the very infant stages of it. Where does Australia stand?
Well, the exact discussions I'm not aware of or familiar with.
Yeah.
However, we are so far superior, I would assume, in relation to the Sri Lankan standard, because while I was in Sri Lanka, I have to represent a client as a defense counsel in relation to the Australian Federal Police and the Australian Taxation Office, ATO. Yeah. And it was something to do with another country and a cryptocurrency. So the Australian Federal Police wanted to confiscate those, whatever you call it, the currency.
Right.
And it was an ex parte. That means they have not told our client that they're going to get these restraints and all that, and they're going to apply for a forfeiture application.
Okay.
And we applied for an exclusion. These are all technical stuff, excluding from forfeiture basically. Yeah. But they wanted the funds to go into the Australian Federal Police cryptocurrency account.
Okay,
so they can hold it there.
Something like that is present there.
Correct. Yeah. So, so what that shows us is they're up there, they're there. Yeah. So they have the systems in place. Right. Even if you're doing fraud through, because that's one area that people use cryptocurrency to exchange money between jurisdictions which are which may not go into the mainstream or not divulge, or tax avoidance systems and all those are there. Yeah. So and the judge also knew, was very familiar of the process.
Okay.
Of course, research may need to be done, but those aspects are there.
Right. I think that's a good background in terms of what exactly is happening in that front, which is the most recent, I think, discussion in terms of finance in the world, I would say. As a final question for this segment, Mr. Dinesh, where do you think in terms of creating trade between these two countries, between migrants of these two specific countries, what are the most key things that we need to focus on right now, but as Sri Lankans, if you are taking in money there, or if you're trying to build a certain business there, other way around, if you're trying to have some form of partnership going, where are the areas that you think need current focus, where does a person need to really focus on when it comes to the legal elements? What is the general advice you would give them?
I'll first start off with answering your question in a different way, non-legal elements.
Yeah.
The political structure and corruption and red tape should be eliminated. Okay. I went to a bank to encourage a formation of a company where they could provide services from Sri Lanka to Australian firms, law firms and including financial firms. And I was asked to get stamps. Now, who uses stamps in this day and age? But I was asked to do that. So that's just a very simple example. But the corruption is number one. I've been approached by a number of people through Sri Lankan connections who have turned and coming to Australia to check, because they've been played around by the Sri Lankan authorities, people with power in this country, bribery and corruption. So that's a sad aspect. We've lost so many investments because of that. The other thing is, as I indicated, the ease of business. That's what any investor will be looking at. Good. And also, if you get into trouble, a tribunal process or an arbitration process. Now, countries in Asia are trying hard, like Thailand, or for that matter, even countries like Indonesia, Bali, they're trying to promote those destinations as hubs for business meetings and mediation, arbitration processes.
The MICE version of tourism. Yeah.
Correct. So that brings in money, as well as from legal point of view. If we have trained arbitrators, mediators, so that's just one suggestion.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think very important clarification there. We'll take a very short break, and I want to get into something that certain Sri Lankans would be interested in, which is the conversation on citizenship. You're watching Law and Liberty. Stay with us.
is Supani Apsara. I am a postgraduate student reading for my Masters in Teaching English as a Second Language at the University of Sri Jayawardhanapura. My question is on citizenship. How has the law on citizenship changed over time in different countries?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in conversation with Mr. Dinesh Weerakkody. We are talking about migration law, and I think we pivoted into many areas, very interesting areas. This segment we want to really focus on the issues of citizenship. I think it's a broad topic that I really couldn't place a certain term on it, but as the wording citizenship came up with, migration happens in a number of forms. I think we can split, the basic split can be either legal or illegal sort of migration. Where does this entire conversation now, we hear when we speak to people, now there's a lot of association with Sri Lankans in Australia as well, of either going in as an asylum seeker, as a refugee, and that trying to do something and get on with life in Australia. But there are also legal channels, which is what's primarily promoted. Can you give us firstly a breakdown of what these specific channels are, what is being used right now, and what are the sort of, I would say barriers, but the regulations that are in place in those areas?
I'll probably first start off with asylum seekers. Yeah. So asylum seekers are the people who are determined and become refugees with a refugee status. And you also mentioned the legal avenues. Yeah. Can I point out, under international conventions and accepted norms and protocols, a person coming in a way that is usually not accepted, in an unlawful way, in a normal sense, according to these protocols, if a person is coming to seek asylum, that shouldn't be looked at in a very disadvantaged way, or we shouldn't say he's an illegal arrival. In the perception of Australia? Seeking asylum, yeah. Correct. And of course, if someone comes through a system and they don't put an application or apply for asylum and stays in Australia without a visa, that we call them an unlawful non-citizen. Right. And if it's found, they'll be put in detention. Right. Now, in Australian terms, the Australian government, the attitude of the current and the recent past governments have been that they don't want to encourage arrivals through boat, right. Unregulated arrivals, because they want to break the people smuggling model. Okay. And at least that's what the government says. Yeah. Which is, to a certain extent, is correct. Yeah. So when you arrive through a boat, through means people consider illegal, yeah. You're put in detention until your application is processed. But if you travel to Australia using a particular visa in a legal way through a plane, if you get down and if you apply for asylum that way, you'll get a bridging visa. Okay. That is, you have legal status. You're not an unlawful non-citizen until your application is processed. Okay. And similarly, you can come as a skilled migrant through legal means. Of course, I don't see why they should come in a boat without a visa if you're skilled and if you have a visa. Visitor visas, you can come and you can apply for skilled migration, or you can apply for asylum that way. So those are the avenues. Yeah. Now, you mentioned citizenship. Some get confused with the permanent residency. That name is very misleading. Say, permanent resident visa is actually not an ongoing, continuous permanent residency in a sense. Right. It is if you continue to stay. Now, that visa is, let's say, given for, let's say, 5 years, right? As an example. Yeah. If you continue to stay in Australia, you can continue to stay, even that 5 years has expired. Okay. If you leave, you cannot come back. Okay. So your permanency is gone. Right. Australia expects permanent residents at some time to be considered and want encourage to apply for citizenship. Right. And that doesn't happen with citizenship. So that's the difference. So you become a permanent resident. There's one avenue and mostly widely used path to become an Australian citizen with a passport holder. Of course, a citizen holds a passport. So you become a permanent resident. And if you meet certain requirements, including a tough character test, which includes security, national security, and so on and so forth, then you apply, you take an oath of allegiance to Australia, and you become a citizen.
Okay. So just to, I think I don't want to get you to repeat yourself, but the pathway to becoming a citizen in that scenario would be to get PR first, and as in permanent citizen visa first, and then to remain in the country for a certain period of time, after which it will continue to extend, or how does it?
Usually yes. Now, if you're an Australian passport holder, or if one parent is an Australian passport holder, the child will automatically become an Australian.
Okay.
So that's a direct pathway.
If the child is born in Australia, or that doesn't matter? Doesn't matter. Okay.
So, so that's another pathway. Likewise, there are few avenues. I was focusing more on migrants who have migrated on a permanent resident visa, and the pathway to be eligible for the citizenship and ultimately obtain the citizenship.
Right. In terms of refugees in that scenario, I think we spoke a bit about asylum seekers. What distinctions are made for refugees? I think if a clarification can be made about what the asylum seeker and how that distinction has been made, and why promote the legal avenues. I think that is the most important question that I want to ask you as well. Why should, if a Sri Lankan is looking at this, use these avenues that are present, that are legal, that will ultimately benefit them in the long run?
Right. Look, as also a lawyer focusing on human rights, although many people use the word illegal avenues, well, it may be illegal in terms of Sri Lankan laws to leave Sri Lanka without obtaining some kind of a permission or a pass or something, whatever you call it. So that aspect is different. However, in considering our international obligations, when I say as an Australian, our international obligations, as I said earlier, you can go to Australia using non-conventional ways, in other terms, let's say illegal ways, but that's not per se as such illegal if you are planning to apply for asylum.
Right.
And if you are assessed, you become a refugee, an accepted refugee. But that boat arrival is very minor, considering the Australian refugee intake through other channels.
Okay.
And it's very minor, but boat arrivals get prominence in media.
Right. Just to build on our previous segment as well, Mr. Weerakkody, is there an avenue where if an investment is being made, if there is a certain amount of funds that are made, just to get a clarification, is there a policy from the side of Australia to give priority in those scenarios to either PR or either citizenship, or is it particularly with regards to the skills that the person brings into the country?
No, there are, as I said, various ways. Now we've got a task force to choose global talents, and there's a global talent visa, which is open for scientists, sports people, anyone who has an international standing. Basically. That's only one aspect. So, but for investors, there are various investor streams. It's technically called 188 visas. So depending on the nature of their investment, and the nature of the business proposal, various states encourage you to come, and also those people can come and go and do, say for example from Sri Lankan point of view, have businesses with Sri Lanka. Usually a person who's a successful business owner in their country are successful because he or she knows the process in that country. Sometimes they may have difficulties in being successful in Australia. However, somehow because of their capabilities and investments, they can manage. So it's okay, I guess, for Sri Lankans to invest in Australia and become residents and dual citizens, and have a mutually beneficial business process.
Mr. Weerakkody, if just to as final question on this segment, just taking a step back on the business climate there now. I want to get a comparison on, since we spoke about the ease of doing business, and that index is something we've spoken about, I think maybe about 10, 12 months back, about how Sri Lanka needs to really focus on getting itself at least to a certain level there, if you have to remain competitive in this region particularly. What are the key comparisons that you will make? What are the key things that you will say, okay, this particular reason makes me as an investor, I would be better off in Australia than coming to Sri Lanka? Or what are the things that we can learn in that scenario?
I'll answer it in a different way.
Yeah.
Say Australia did look at this, and we've had a commission or a committee looking into our red tape in Australia, and there were recommendations were implemented and followed up.
Okay.
We could have in Sri Lanka, I know we also have committees and whatnot, but the recommendations are not being implemented.
Yeah.
So that is one thing we should be look at, because to do whatever we have to identify the issues that we have, and when there are recommendations by experts, we have to implement those things to make it easy. So as you said, it's probably well known even for Sri Lankans the issues that we face.
Yeah.
What the foreigners usually face is what I've already highlighted previously, which is corruption.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is devastating for us, and they don't like it. They like to be straightforward, especially Western countries, where the regimes of paying bribes in a political is an issue in Australia or in Western countries for those companies. So that needs to be looked in very carefully. That discourages investment. And then I'm repeating myself, the red tape.
Yeah, right. I think that makes sense. We'll take a very short break, and I think this really opens the window to the ethics aspect that I want to discuss with you and give some time for you. You're watching Law, Line and Liberty. Stay with us on this as we continue this discussion on the reformation aspect and how to include ethics that we can learn from Australia particularly.
My name is Tikshana Costa. I'm from private university, and the question is, what are the key areas of reform that must be made in relevance to migration?
All right, welcome back to Law, Line and Liberty. You are joining us on our last segment, a very interesting discussion, Ms. Weerakkody, that we've had so far. The final segment, just to widen our entire scope when it comes to migration law, I want to sort of draw from you certain lessons that we can learn in terms of the systems that have been followed, particularly in Australia now. The aspect of ethics, it's been talked about even within this program. We have had it is spoken about quite a number of times about what exactly is the role of an advocate, what should be done. I want to keep it general and get you to give, because even in the previous segment you spoke about the red tapes, you spoke about corruption, things that need reformation maybe on a practical end more than policy end. Apart from that, where else do you think there are certain deficiencies pertaining to the ethics aspect in this field? How do you enter that one?
Right. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I know you're a law graduate and an aspiring lawyer to be, I guess.
Yeah.
Did you learn a subject called ethics? Did you have an ethics subject in your curriculum?
Yeah. So the issue is I'm still in my preliminary years, and I haven't. Yeah, and so far no. So far
right.
no. Yeah.
In
college.
the law faculty, you did?
I studied an LLB from Royal Institute.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. Okay.
There was no particular emphasis on ethics.
Right.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm aware, there's no registration system, an annual registration system for lawyers in Sri Lanka.
Right.
I may be wrong, but as far as I'm aware, in Australia, if I'm correct, I know the Australian standards, lawyers need to register and get a practicing certificate each year.
Right.
In order to get that, we have to provide a certain number of subjects, a complete certain number of subjects, which we call CPDs, continuous professional education.
Right.
Education. Now, again, in relation to handling clients' money, if the monies are taken or given in advance for work that has not been completed, the lawyers needs to have a account called trust account. You can't just put it in your pocket or your current account.
Right.
The funds needs to go to the trust account. You are holding on behalf of the client on trust.
Right.
And you have to give a cost agreement.
Okay.
Indicating the charges, the fees, and estimation of the cost for this matter.
Okay.
And I don't think that kind of a system exists in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
The consumers, if I may call people who are coming to seek advice from lawyers, are at a disadvantaged position for a number of reasons because of the power imbalance, as well as they are vulnerable because of the situations they are in. It's like going to a doctor when you have a medical situation, they are mentally down most of the time. So if those regulations are not there in place in the system, within the system, which I think they're not in Sri Lanka, because I have not heard any lawyer giving a cost agreement from my preliminary research before I came to this meeting, which is a very sad situation for a country that has had the British legal system, and prior to that Western influence, and then since 48 we've had our own regulations and ability to make laws, and if it is still not there, we haven't learned anything. So, and if our legal system is like that, if that is how our law profession is guided, it's very sad.
Right. Mr. Weerakkody, if just to build on the aspect of reforms and the aspect of ethics that are involved here, let's talk a bit about the legal system per se, without as we move into the sort of practical and the behavioral side of advocates and lawyers that are present within our country. Where do you think we can make some key changes in terms of the policy aspect, in terms of the legislature, to cater to either making this a destination that would maybe level up from where we are right now, to make it friendly? Because why I'm asking this is to draw from the sort of experiences you have in other regions which would follow maybe a common law system as well. What needs to happen most immediately, the most immediate concerns that you see in terms of changing policy, without talking about maybe red tape or without talking about the practical elements? What are those things that we need to introduce right now?
If we can introduce laws that are practical and timely, through of course law reform commissions and suggestions, and going through the proper process, and then implemented with after consultations with various groups, relevant groups, and if we can have them continually processed, assessed and developed to the needs of the time, which is called the continuous improvement process. If those systems can be put in place, that will be great. Because we cannot depend on old systems, and we cannot move forward if we don't take into consideration the developments or the needs of the people. For example, I've discussed in another forum where for family law, for divorce, we still have the fault-based system. And in Australia, we have the no-fault system. This is of course for a family that the relationship has irretrievably broken down. We are not trying to encourage separations here. But once a party is separated, or at least one party thinks that at least for 12 months, if they have not lived as husband and wife, why should you make it more difficult than what it is currently? So the continuous process through a methodical, organized way is quite important to keep us up to date with, at least with the laws. So if there is no proper law and order in the country, it's downhill.
Mr. Weerakkody, I think a lot more things that I would like to ask you, but unfortunately time has come against us as usual within this program. We will have to leave it at that, and hopefully we'll get to discuss with each other certain other topics also, given your vast experience within multiple fields. Mr. Dinesh Irriyagolla Weerakkody, a solicitor and a barrister, thank you so much for joining us on this program today.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. As we discuss the laws related to migration, it is important to bear in mind one's duty to one's own country. It is the leadership's responsibility to make sure life at one's home country is habitable for an individual's aspirations. Former US Ambassador to South Africa, William L. Swing, once said, "We cannot and should not stop people from migration. We have to give them a better life at home. Migration is a process, not a problem." That is all from us here at Law, Land and Liberty. If you had missed today's program, you can rewatch the entire episode on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/otherthanenglish. I'm Daniel Tanavasam. Have a great night.